And welcome back to another episode of Into the Wilderness, brought to you by CEWIL Canada. I'm your host, Dan Lonergan, and we are still coming to you live from Halifax, Nova Scotia, 2023 in-person conference. Very exciting. We're wrapping up day two, getting into the wee hours of the evening here, but still recording content, which just gets me absolutely excited. And just seeing the energy in people and talking to people that haven't seen in 5 years or haven't even met in person continues to be just an outstanding conference, and already looking forward to next year. And hopefully we'll find out soon where that might be, and we will share it with you when we do. So on this episode, we're going to be diving in a little bit into the world of accreditation from CEWIL. So as most of you may or may not know, CEWIL does accredit institutions' cooperative education programs to meet a standard set of guidelines and regulations to build some consistency around that type of will, and has been doing so for quite some time, and continues to kind of be a leading example in the world of how to set standards for a certain type of work integrated learning. So my two guests today are very active in the conversation around what the current accreditation process at CEWIL looks like, potential changes, or how to change up the guidelines, and make suggestions to maybe what the next iteration of accreditation looks like, and for good reason to look into it. So thrilled to welcome to the show Krezek, who's the Director of Co-op Career and Experiential Education at Brock University, also my colleague, but I'll suspend the Brock role again for this episode. And Anne-Marie Fannon, who is the Director of the Work Learn Institute at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks.
Thanks for taking the time this evening to come sit in this little room here. And hey, we make do with what we've got, and I'm just excited again to have video content. I don't know if this is going to be a recurring thing that we keep doing for the show, but at least for the purpose of recording during this conference, we're going to lean into it. We're going to have the video content up on YouTube. You can find the show everywhere you normally do: Spotify, Google Podcasts. So talk to me a little bit about accreditation for co-op programs at CEWIL. Even just like a quick history for those that maybe are new to their institution, new to maybe a co-op role. When did it start? What does it look like? What's that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something we really need to be critically proud of in Canada. So accreditation has been around since 1979. It's the only active accreditation process in the world. And it's incredibly valuable that in a country like Canada, where education falls under provincial jurisdiction, we have a national definition of co-op. We have standards that have been adopted by the community, have been adopted by some of our provincial governments, by the federal government in the past, and that schools that aren't able to attain accreditation status right now still strive towards. And certainly in the conversations that we've had thus far and the work that we're doing, we hear a lot of pride with what those accreditation standards have done for co-op in Canada, and rightly so. Employers do not balk at the idea of paying a student, and I believe wholeheartedly that that is because we set a standard over 40 years ago to say, if you want a co-op student, you're going to pay them. And building that consistency of experience for employers, for institutions, has raised awareness of co-op, interest in co-op, and the ability to really have a strong ecosystem.
Yeah, the one thing I would add too is it's a replicable process, right? So the other thing that we've seen is that if you're looking to build a co-op program, there's actually a framework that helps build that from scratch. So while it's, there's a lot to it, it also, I think that's another reason why we have such richness in Canada about like pay, about, some of the standards. And it does create even though each institution may run it a little bit differently, it does have this framework that people can follow to create good co-op programs.
Well, I've talked a number of times on this show, as I kind of tap into different types of work integrated learning and have guests from, various backgrounds in that space. Co-op continues to be the most recognized form, especially in industry, right? Like most, I don't know how you want to quantify the word most, but in my mind, it's a decent amount of people in industry understanding Canada what the word co-op means. Some interchange it with internship and, maybe don't know the subtle differences. And I think institutions tend to create those. But co-op because I think of, this consistent element that comes through, whether it's solely this accreditation or just growth over time, that it is something where people go, oh, I know I have a good understanding of what that means. And then in talking to an institution, they understand maybe, more of the nuances behind different programs and durations and things like that.
I think even though when you're saying that, one of the things that happens with this though is that then because co-op is so recognized, people want to call everything co-op.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Right. So I was having a conversation at a recent conference, and when I was having this conversation, it was, that's not co-op. And I think that one of the things that's great that CEWIL has done is expanded into all types of work integrated learning. And we need to also celebrate those other types of work integrated learning so that from a marketing perspective, people want to call things co-op, even though that they're not. So, and it's okay. I think it's great if something's, there's all different types of will that are out there, and it doesn't work for every institution, for every person. So part of the work that we're doing is actually continuing to look at what is co-op, but also so that we can continue to lift all types of work integrated learning.
For sure. So talk to me a little bit about the work that you are doing. So, you mentioned we've been doing this for 40 years in terms of accrediting. What are you looking at currently? What are some of the things where you go, man, it might be time to change some of that or tweak it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been tasked with revisiting all of the guidelines, and not only the guidelines, but the rationale behind them. So, the WIL nerds amongst us know that there is a document called Standards and Rationale that explains what the co-op standards are and why the co-op standards exist. And so we have kind of undertaken this process of really trying to go deep into the current accreditation standards, process, challenges, understand what's going on right now, and then a deep dive into the standards and rationale, and then bringing in different perspectives and different lenses to say, does this standard still make sense? And does it make sense with a changing world of work? Does it make sense when you put a lens of EDIA on? Does it make sense now that there are 8 other forms of work integrated learning that are recognized by CEWIL? And we've been calling it kind of like accreditation Jenga. So it's such an ecosystem, and the power of those existing standards are really, really strong. But do we have a clear understanding of why they exist from a research perspective, from an operations perspective? And do we really know what happens if you pull this block and this block and this block? Does the system stay strong and more flexible, or is it going to topple?
Yeah. So any examples that come to mind of, something that you looked at and said, well, maybe that's something that we should look to change?
Yes. So we did, part of our process has been consultation, but also, so we kind of first started looking at how do we understand what the accreditation is and the guidelines and rationale. And then we started to kind of dive into it, and then consultation. So I think both between what we heard and what we saw, there's a lot of opinions about maybe it doesn't matter if it ends on a work term, or why does co-op have to, on an academic term, why does it have to end on an academic term? And then, so that's one of the big conversations. We had a great conversation. I say debate actually today earlier. It was a feisty conversation. And the other one that tends to come up quite a bit is the part-time co-op. So even what we mean by part-time being like, is it about being a part-time student, or is it part-time work? Or in some areas it's called parallel co-op, and that is a form of co-op in other countries. So right now within our guidelines, it's full-time only. So what does that look like? And if that were to change, what could that look like? So that we don't, again, talking about the Jenga, if we change that, what will it do to the system? So these are some of I think the two, the biggest ones. There's ones have come up that I think that some of the feedback that we've heard is around not necessarily understanding, or the evidence that is put out doesn't really make sense to the actual to the standard,
Okay.
right? So the the rationale and the standard don't match. So that was the other pieces. So we've been doing some of that work too, is looking at, and we have a team of people that we're working with that are looking at the different evidence. So it's not that we believe that that should be no longer the case, but we need some better rationale in order to explain it to people so that they understand.
Makes sense. So you mentioned this session that you delivered earlier today, kind of, you could probably argue both sides specifically maybe of those 2 points that you articulated, whether it's ending on a work term or whatever, however we want to refer part-time, right? Whether is that, like you mentioned, is it a part-time student or is it part-time work or is it both? In your consultations that you mentioned, who's involved in the consultation? Like is industry involved, students, other practitioners? What does that look like?
So primarily at this point in time, it's been the CEWIL community.
Okay.
There's more consultation and conversations to be had. And it isn't to say that the voices of students and employers aren't critically important, but I think we also have to recognize that their understanding of the Jenga blocks are very different than our understanding of the Jenga blocks. And I think that when we look at these changes, it's why we need to bring in these voices and kind of highlight them and articulate some of the challenges, because oftentimes a school can rightly look at a criterion and say, I don't understand. Like, I don't understand why we would need to have students available in all seasons. But those of us that have been running the programs for a long time recognize that when we have students that are available year round, employers create positions for students. And that's very, very different than a summer internship model, which is problematic in many other jurisdictions around the world. So that's maybe a caution in the extent to which we do consult beyond the CEWIL community, because some employers are going to say, absolutely, I want them work term at the end, or absolutely, I want them for 12 months, not 4 months. Why are you giving them to me for 4 months? And so we want to hear their voices, but at the end of the day, it's operations of co-op and an ecosystem perspective that really matter.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think, maybe does it get to a point of maybe where it's less of a rigid form of rules, and there are circumstances where maybe exceptions could potentially be made. And I know just from my conversations with industry, I'll pick on the engineering industry, where they have been quite vocal that, and I think it happens in most engineering schools, they need a student for longer than 4 months. They want them for a full year or more because of the nature of the work, the time it takes to acclimatize them to, day-to-day operations. And depending on the type of engineering, I think that fluctuates. A close friend of mine going through an aerospace engineering program, intensive in terms of the on the site work that needed to be done. In 4 months, you basically just get through bare minimum training. So, I mean, I think that, where did we come from originally of like, no, it must be 4 months and then you go back. And I know that that's changed, and a lot of schools have, back-to-back work terms or full year work terms, if it makes sense for kind of all the parties involved. So what might be some of these is something like ending on a work term, depending on the situation. Okay, maybe we have a conversation when that comes up.
And I mean, I think that example just kind of brings to light for me again some of the challenges in maybe prioritizing an employer perspective or privileging a student perspective, because I think a lot of times about the structure that we put in place for co-op, where students get an opportunity to explore different industries, different organizations. And when we talk about the future of work, and I'm pretty passionate about this, moving in and out of organizations and figuring out what your values are and how your skills transfer, to me, is this gorgeous preparatory ground for a future of work that is going to be rapidly changing. And, like if you looked at something like the German dual model, they think it's fantastic. Employers get a student with them throughout the 4 years, and then that student is trained to work for that one organization that may have major layoffs 1 year after that student graduates. Whereas in our current co-op model, they are being equipped to understand their skills, understand their values, and articulate them to a breadth of employers. And so that's something that's really important that I think we don't want to lose.
I think it goes to talk about the systems thinking again, right? So if this, then what? Or even, talking about from an educative model, like the co-op itself is not just about the job, right? It's also about career exploration. It's about who am I now? It is about this journey as well. And those of us that work in this space and have seen, the ups and downs or the reasons why you think that might be a good idea until you live the
Yeah.
experience of, oh, wait, we didn't think about that, right? Or, the entire system, I think the strengths of the Canadian system is what you said about, they develop jobs, but it's paid, like,
Yeah.
like it's paid work experience. And yes, it's used for pipelining talent. It's also used for career exploration. It's also a lifelong learning skill to know how to manage your career. So if I get like, yes, it's great that you go work for this one employer. And I think we've seen this in the accounting industry, a big shift over the years where, like, if you went to go work with an accounting firm, you got that one,
Yeah.
and then you stayed with them.
Especially if it was like a big four. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And then we started to hear from students, I don't really want to stay with the same one. And like that shifted that. And even in the conversation around engineering, I think that there is going again, looking at the employer and looking at their perspective, which obviously we need to be looking at. But we really do need to make sure that we're not going to do something that then disrupts. And I'm okay with disruption. I'm totally fine with that. But I do think that we want to also make sure that we don't do anything unintentionally that's disruptive,
Right.
that's not helpful. Yeah.
One, and I was talking to an individual earlier, I think maybe that attended your session, and that was kind of where my head was, because from my experience and the conversations I've had and the people I've talked to, co-op it has that element of consistency, and part of that is because of the accreditation that's in there. So if you start to take those blocks out, I'll lean into the Jenga reference, and it does start to topple. Then, I mean, where I look at the 8, maybe not apprenticeships, so maybe the 7 other types of will, there's very little consistency, like across the country, whether it's the way that institutions operationalize them or the way that industry understands them. And I think we would like some of those to get a little bit more. So if we have one that has it, is removing pieces of that consistency the best idea, or do we embody these things and just call it something different? Like,
Exactly.
Yes.
like, and it's, okay, like internships, typically big, long internships happen at the end of a degree. It's the last thing students do. They're usually not, if it's like a multi-100-hour internship, they're done their coursework. You do your internship. In most cases, hopefully it's a paid internship. And I think a lot of those industries that tap into internships are starting to realize they also have to pay to attract top talent. I'll pick on the sports industry. We're seeing a lot of those internships starting to have to pay students because they're just, I'm not going to do it.
That's right.
Right. And I think, we, from our keynote yesterday, it's, this generation, they're loyal, but they want to be paid. And if they're treated well, they'll stick with you. So how do you meet them where they're at, type thing. But yeah, to take away the consistency for the sake of change or to disrupt, I mean, you can disrupt in positive ways.
Well, and I think that the thing too is, like, every lens we've been looking at this, we've been using the AAA framework, and part of this too is keeping in mind that I'm going to go to the Nora's other framework of pairs. Like, this is a pedagogical approach as well, right? Like, so there's much more to this than just work. And like, even if you want to do, and I guess one of the questions we have is, if you want to have something end on a work term, why would you not just put the concept of an internship out there versus co-op?
Yeah.
And that goes back to what I was saying about the market and the brand of co-op is one of the reasons that happens. But, even we looked at continuous co-op as one of the, right now we have 2 models of co-op. One is the how do they
Alternating.
alternating?
And, internship.
An internship, but we're looking at, should we call this continuous? We're in the middle of their program that they're doing back to back to back, which is already part of the accreditation guidelines. And we're thinking, well, we should maybe, so we don't confuse internship and co-op, we call it continuous. But what makes that still a co-op? Is it required that every 4 months or every 420 hours that the same thing has they still have the same requirements as a co-op.
Yep.
And then the other piece that's come up around, again, future work is multiple employers. And we saw this during COVID, that we were kind of putting together, like, this was where some of this is coming from, that during COVID, we were being creative around, can we have multiple employers, can freelance, the gig economy, those kind of things. And it was actually funny because as we started to pull this apart, we're like, we have entrepreneurial co-op that actually fits really well with this. So we can use those guidelines for the freelance, the, multiple, but there are some, there's some, if that, then what, if you have multiple employers. I think that somebody brought this up to you, was what happens if one of those employers says that the person, didn't do what they were supposed to? Does that person fail now? But the other two were okay. Like, how do you manage that? So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about too.
And I imagine that narrative probably, get into like the part-time conversation that starts to pop up as well.
Exactly it.
I mean, again, depending on if we're looking at whether it's part-time work or a part-time student, it's probably more just on the part-time work equation of that, of how do you measure that in a similar fashion to full-time work. And then you start to unpack, well, what can the industry support, and can every industry support part-time work? And I think even just from my experience in other types of WIL, some can't. And again, back to my point about the training and the duration that it takes just to get somebody up to speed. If we're only looking at like 150 or 200 hours, the industry may not want that, but it's in other cases, they would love it. Right?
Yeah. And I think that just highlights again the importance of the fact that this work is being done at the same time that the standards for other forms of WIL are being created.
Right.
Because up until this point in time, if you couldn't get your program accredited as a co-op program, you had nothing. And co-op was the brand, and schools wanted to call it co-op.
Yep.
But if, as you said earlier, we can have quality standards for field placements or internships or work experience, and you can say, I have a really strong work experience WIL program. That becomes the language. The only reason the brand of co-op is as strong as it is because that's the part that had the standards and that we talked about and socialized. And so there's going to be an adjustment period for sure. But now we don't have to, we have to look at, do the standards serve the intentions of co-op? Not do the standards serve the intentions of work integrated learning? And those are
That's a really good point.
100%.
Yeah, distinct conversations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other piece, to add on is one of the guiding principles is like we also are looking at the evidence. So what does the evidence say about part-time work? What does it say about onboarding? So we don't know all of that. Like that's some of the work that we're doing, and also making sure that we're not allowing one particular voice or a very strong voice to come in and say like, we want this, or I want to end on a work term because it works for my institution. Like we understand that in some ways that there are the operational pieces, but because we don't live that experience right now, although I will say within my institution, we have unaccreditable programs, and those programs actually can be problematic because we live the experience of why. And so one of the things is, but we don't want one particular voice to oversee things, but we need to look and see in the limited evidence if there is things that we can even like use to parlay to the work that we're doing.
Right. And I mean, I've lived experience as a part-time student doing a graduate program, but I was working full-time so I wouldn't have been able to participate in any kind of part-time WIL that was outside of my course. And I've also been involved in other types of WIL that could be deemed part-time, right? Short-term field placements, practicums, and going through a teacher education program. I was sharing in that program, no discredit to teacher education programs by any means, but until you get to teachers college, where it's intensive, it's long, you're embedded right in the class, you're actually doing the teaching. The field placements and the practicums that kind of go up to that point are short, they're observational, and there's just reasons why that might be the case, but I watched a ton of my peers get to teachers college and collapse because they couldn't be in front of a class, but they hadn't been, but that's 4 years, 5 years into a program. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Like, you're in it at that point. You're not changing your course
Yeah.
4 or 5 years in. It's a very specific example. It's just something that kind of came to mind when we talk about that, and in terms of the potential, I guess, negative side effect of shorter term will. And again, there's really valuable and rich short forms of will that are highly, highly impactful and effective. It's just one thing that I saw in terms of, if those were longer earlier, would more students be able to decide maybe this isn't the right. So to your point about multiple employers, the positive is like, oh, you get a wide variety of backgrounds and skill sets. The flip side, and I think we say this in other types of will, is like, well, it helps you figure out maybe what you don't want to do either.
We just heard students actually when we had a student panel, which was fabulous, and student panel for National Conversation in Ottawa. And, I thought was really great. One of the students was talking about he had worked for public, he worked for, private, he worked big company, small company, and then public. And even like just that from an industry perspective, not even like just a one employer. It's like you're talking various industries, and that's the career exploration. It's that wayfinding, what I don't want to do. And I think a lot of us in this space will say, if you're in a 1 year, your first year program, you already look at how many people. So research shows that people can name 8 jobs when they're going into university.
Yeah.
So now you've done 1 year of academics and or college, and you come in, you do 1 year of academics, and then you do a work experience. You're like, whoa, this is not what I wanted. Right. Before you continue to invest in this. But also if you have it depends on where they would end on a work tour. We have to think about that particular student. What does that do? Lots to consider.
Yeah, and the other thing that I might add is just as we explore the standards for these other forms of work integrated learning, and I know I'm very much speaking from a university perspective, longer period of time here, but I think it also allows us to say what forms of work integrated learning can we bring together to best support the student and their needs based on the program. And you hit on this exactly, Dan, when you're talking about different industries and their ability to bring in students differently. And I think of this example of pharmacy at Waterloo that is the only co-op program in Canada, and that typically they don't have co-op because you need to have practicums, you need to have, meet certain learning outcomes under the supervision of pharmacists. You're not a licensed pharmacist. But what they did was they were able to come up with a model that had both. They have unpaid practicums, but they also have paid co-op work terms. And so the students are getting exposure to different roles and aspects of the industry, regular income throughout their undergrad, which helps them or they're not an undergrad now, it's a PharmD, but they're able to then manage that unpaid placement because they had income from their previous co-ops. So I think as this all comes together, it doesn't all have to be co-op, and co-op can stay a specific, discrete, and special form of will, as they all are. And so that's, I think, the real challenge for us as we work through this.
It takes time and careful attention. And I think with changes in looking at some of the other types of will, maybe it does help to make a clearer picture of we've got nine different types. And I think co-op is pretty cool. Apprenticeships, I think people are pretty well understood behind that. So it's these other 7, and where do we start, and how does doing that help what we've built for co-op even more. But with that, I just want to thank you both. I know the band is playing. I can kind of hear it coming through. So usually I put a little kind of background track. I might not have to do that on this episode. We'll just pick up the audio from the band. But Cara and Ann, thank you very much for taking the time tonight to come and sit down and talk a little bit about accreditation, and looking forward to hearing what comes of it, and kind of see the changes that institutions can look forward to if they're not already accredited, or even in reaccreditation process, and what's to come with other types of will.
Yeah, lots there too. So thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
And thanks again for tuning in. This may be our last live episode. Well, we'll see. We'll see how the night goes. If there's anyone else that wants to come and talk about work integrated learning. But as always, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time.